So a few words about where we are in this cycle and with this parsha, as I mentioned earlier, which has this very important paragraph of the Shema. This is Parshat Eikev, which means we're moving through the book of Deuteronomy. And those who are following the parshiot closely, there's a very painful and profound texture as the story is coming closer and closer to the end. This is the period in which Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, is reviewing his life, really, and the life of the people, and retelling the story, which we've already heard, sometimes a little differently, as people retell the stories of our lives at different times, sometimes quite similarly, but it's the time of telling what happened, but close to the end of his life. It's what many people call in the business, the life review that a lot of people go through. Should we be lucky enough to live to an old age? Very common to begin this process of a life review. Of course, it's also happening in this season between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, leading up to Elul, where we all should be in some form of a life review, an annual review. So it's a little bit of a reminder. We have Moses going through this process of looking back on his life, reviewing with great detail in some cases and quite a lot of honesty his mistakes, the mistakes of the people, the mistakes of God. There are a lot in all three categories, and Moses reviews them, and it's as if, and I think we all know what this is like, there's a search for meaning at this point. There's no longer a relitigation of who was right and who was wrong. It's really about trying to understand the takeaway. What does it mean? What does my life mean? That there were all these mistakes. And this parsha continues to go through a lot of those mistakes in great detail. But it is part of this period, not but, and, or something else besides but. I didn't mean but. It is during this period of this 7 weeks of consolation, which is also part of this, because the 7 weeks of consolation are the lead up to Rosh Hashanah, this interweaving of reflection, of self-reflection, which Moses is doing, and the period of time leading from Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah, and doing self-reflection on the year and on our life, preparing to enter into the days of awe with some openness and some new level of understanding. But the 7 weeks are known, as I mentioned last week, as weeks of consolation, because Tisha B'Av was so painful, because it is a moment of intense concentration of sadness and opening ourselves, if we do it right, to a awareness of so much loss, that we have to have these weeks of consolation. And I don't think it's insignificant. Tisha B'Av is one day, and yes, there are 3 weeks of mourning leading up to Tisha B'Av, but there are 7 weeks of consolation. I think the imbalance in those numbers reflects a lot of truth, right? It takes a long time to recover from sadness. It takes a long time to recover from heartbreak. And part of the truth of our tradition is how deeply honest it is about how difficult recovery is, how much pain there is in the world and in our hearts and in our lives. It doesn't gloss it over. And this cycle that we're in, I think, reflects that really powerfully. The Kotzker Rebbe said very famously, and some of you have heard this before, that there is nothing as whole as a broken heart. There's this depth in our tradition that brokenheartedness and the shattering of the tablets, which also is discussed in this parsha, is absolutely a part of life itself. Not a detour that we have to kind of veer back to the perfect, glossy life, but that broken hearts and the shattering of the tablets are actually what life is. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about that, and some of the things that I've seen and I feel and I've experienced myself, and how I believe our tradition offers us some consolation in this period of consolation. So this parsha has one of the repetitions of the stories, and it is told in great detail in this parsha, is Moses going up the mountain the first time, after 40 days, coming down and seeing that the people completely were out of fear and despair, had created the Egel Hazav, the golden calf, and Moses famously bursts out into, from terrible anger, uncontrolled anger, which, by the way, you have to see that he learned from God's behavior. This absolute out-of-control anger, he has no self-control, he breaks the tablets, and God's anger, he kills a lot of the Israelites out of anger, and there are many days of crushing anger and yelling and despair and death. And then Moses regains some composure, and God says, I'm done, I'm going to kill them all. These people, I have taken them out of slavery, I've given them this, I've given them no gratitude. Who are these people? Their attitude is just give me, give me, give me. And God says, I'm going to kill them all. And Moses comes back from his anger and says, we got to try it again. Goes back up the mountain, 40 more days, comes down, and we know it is on Yom Kippur he comes down 40 days later. And we're told, because the Midrash tells us, because of the text, that Moses, when he put the second set of tablets in the Ark of the Covenant, in the Holy Ark, he also put the shattered pieces from the first one he broke. And the two together were the Holy Ark, the things that were in the Holy Ark, both the whole, the second chance one, and the first one, which was shattered to smithereens. We sometimes need to share the stories of our broken hearts and to listen to the stories of others. Sometimes that's all there is. Mary Oliver, in that great poem of hers, says, tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Sometimes this retelling of the story that Moses does during these weeks of consolation is, I think, part of what we know that helps people repair from tragedy. Think about how many times we've told the story of 9/11 and how it helped us to shape meaning out of those horrific days. In this parsha, all the times the people failed gets repeated. All the times that God fails gets repeated. All the times that Moses failed, over and over again. All the times that fear overcame people in desperation and anger. There's power in telling the stories. One could argue that if you were putting together the sacred text that would be the core text of our people, it would not be filled with so many examples of how God, Moses, and the people fail. But that is essential to who we are as human beings. There is power in telling the stories of pain. There's power in being a witness. And at CBST, I have been a witness to a lot of people's pain. Sometimes it shimmers just below the surface, and sometimes it's on the surface, and sometimes it fills the whole room. There's a lot of pain that doesn't get discussed. There's a lot of pain that human beings are carrying around in the world in which we live. I want to mention a few of them because I think we need to surface them. There's a great deal of pain in our community around children. This isn't the same pain that I discussed, although some of it is still there when I gave that Drashah of mine that many of you remember, that it was time for CBST to open up to children. But I had to acknowledge then, and I do now, that there is still so much pain for people who came out at a time when having children was not a possibility, that one had to choose between having kids and going into a heterosexual marriage, which many in our community did, or not to have kids. There still remains deep, deep, searing pain in our community. And when there are children in our community bouncing about happily and people talk about their kids, know that there are still people in this community in deep pain about not having kids. And then there are children in our community who, despite the idea that we as an LGBTQ queer community would somehow raise kids so differently than generations before, and that the children of our families would somehow be so well adjusted and so fantastic and just so open and just pure and without any of the problems we live with, guess what? There are many people in our community whose children are really suffering. There are many people in our community whose children are devastated by addiction, whose children are in prison, whose children have become radical right-wing people who reject the LGBT community. These people can't speak publicly about their kids in our community necessarily because we have not created an environment in which it's okay to have kids that aren't perfect. Not only not perfect, but really deeply, sometimes mentally ill, sometimes really in places of tremendous pain. I believe we have to create more room for this. We imagined that coming out would mean we would all be pure and it would all solve all of our problems. We only had to come over the hump of coming out. Guess what? It turns out there's a lot of problems after coming out. Relationships don't work out. There's pain of loneliness, of isolation, of being single when people don't want to be single, or people assuming they don't want to be single. We have focused so much on the struggle to get gay marriage, we forgot to adequately prepare for the pain, the expense, and devastation that legal divorce is, and the impact especially on the children. We have many families in our community, mine included, who have suffered tremendously from divorce. There's deep pain of loneliness and isolation and illness. Many in our community are aging solo without children and are not necessarily as open to the presence of or talking about children that some of us who have children do. Look at those with children and imagine their lives are all set and everything's perfect. But there are so many with children in our community, and they don't have the children that the image often creates. Guess what? We are all human beings who are suffering broken hearts. We have the crises of the world, and I speak about them often, but tonight, I really want to focus on the crises in our personal lives. There is long-term COVID. Oh my God, how much have I heard and listened to so many in our community who are really suffering from long-term COVID. Rabbi James is going to be leading a monthly group starting in September for long-term COVID, for folks who are dealing with long-term COVID and just want to have a place to come and talk about it and deal with it. We don't have any magic wands. So the wisdom I get in these 7 weeks of consolation, we need a lot of consolation. 7 weeks is not nearly enough. Be gentle with yourselves if you are suffering. That's the first thing that our tradition tells us. Pain is a part of being a human being. Secondly, this parsha also says the famous line, every human, it says man, but I translate it, human, cannot live on bread alone. Turns out we need music, we need art, we need beauty, we need joy, we need friendships. We have deep human needs that go way beyond the minimal sustenance, which we, of course, absolutely need. That does a lot for consolation. We need friendship. We need connection. The community needs to be ever deepening people's sense of connection one to the other. And it starts with being willing to share our own stories, to be the Moshe Rabbeinu, to share his own story. We need to share ours. We need to be able to listen to others. We need to acknowledge that every single one of us has 2 sets of tablets that we're schlepping around all the time, and they are heavy. One set is broken and just shattered shards that we're schlepping around on our back all the time. But at the same time, each of us is whole in our holiness. Each of us is a holy reflection of the best of humanity. We're both, it turns out. As everyone knows, Psalms mean a lot to me. And for me, consolation and Psalms go deeply together. In Psalm 147, there is a description of God that I want to offer everybody as an image of God to pray to most deeply in these moments when we need consolation, as we prepare to move into the days of awe. Judaism is criticized sometimes as being a religion where God is angry and punishing. But in fact, there are many beautiful images for God, and in Psalm 147, God is called Harofeh L'Shvurei Lev, the one who heals the broken heart. So imagine as we pray for these next few weeks moving into Rosh Hashanah, replace every image you have for God and replace it with the healer. God is the healer of the brokenhearted, and that's who we pray. Healer of the brokenhearted, binder of our wounds, the psalm says. You know who we are. Healer of the brokenhearted, binder of our wounds, please God, see us. Harofeh, the healer of our broken hearts.